Good afternoon. Welcome. It is noon, and we're delighted to have you with us here at the Korea Society. I'm Stephen Erper, the Senior Director for Policy here at the Society. And this is the kickoff of our winter-spring policy season. And we have leaned forward in the spirit of symmetry and progress over this last year to take a look at North Korea with a closer eye. And so we have a number of programs over the spring season, this being the first, which will look at information, access, retrieval, validity, and really how we can all walk away with a better sense that we're dealing with good, creditable information. And so to that end, Jonathan will introduce Chad and Jan to you in just a moment. But I did want to take the time to thank you for your support, point out that we have Phil Sherman here, who's been a very generous supporter as a member of our board. I see Sonia Bachman, the Northeast Asia team leader for the United Nations. She's one of our $500 sustaining level members. So if you're not a member of the Korea Society, we would warmly welcome you to please join or see us at koreasociety.org. And lastly, I'd like to welcome those streaming online. Our online numbers have shot up over the course of this last year. We're very happy about that, and you may find this program via audio podcast or on YouTube video at the conclusion. Let me turn now to Jonathan Corrado, who is my colleague in policy and who is an active information accessor and retrieval person. He does outstanding research. He's a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He worked with McLarty Associates and our chairman, Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, before coming up to the Korea Society. And we've had Jonathan now for a year and 3 months here at the Society, and those of you who have followed our policy programs know that he's very active, and we appreciate everything he does, both in terms of logistics and content. So Jonathan, over to you, and to both Chad and Jan, thank you for taking the time to come in on your way to Washington, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and it's great to get started. This is our first event for policy of the season. It's a cold day out there, so thank you very much for braving the winter cold to make it here for this special event. See a lot of friends, and it's wonderful to have you all. Just to give a brief introduction to two of our speakers today, Chad O'Carroll is the founder of Korea Risk Group, which you'll be very familiar with, and two of the products, NK Pro and NK News. He was formerly the communications director down at the Korea Economics Institute in Washington, D.C. Jan Janowski is a German diplomat who got his training, an MA, I believe, at Korea University, Goryeo-dae, over in Seoul. He served as the second secretary in the German embassy in Pyongyang from 2012 to 2015, an experience that I expect that we'll get into during the course of our conversation. He's fluent in Korean, and as I verified earlier when I met him, he can also do North Korean, which is a rare skill indeed. So for my first question, I'm going to jump right into the latest news. And then in my second question, I'm going to chastise myself for making that very indulgence. For those of you who haven't seen, the Chosun Ilbo has reported that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol are expected to meet this week, and the discussion is in the air for some sort of the U.S. considering an interim deal, exchanging some kind of sanctions alleviation for a nuclear freeze, perhaps sending off a portion or a large, small, or all of North Korea's ICBMs. Remains a little ambiguous. I wanted to ask you both your thoughts on this. Is this progress, a concession? Does this type of exchange bring us closer to the end goal of denuclearization, further away? Can you read the tea leaves on this for us a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind last year there were several working level meetings between Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol, and we were expecting there to be another summit, and then that all sort of fell through the cracks and the summit didn't take place. So, you know, it looks like this time it might be different because there's so much chatter about there being a potential summit in Vietnam, maybe as soon as February or early March. But we just don't know. There are a few big obstacles for them to overcome, and the key issue really is down to phasing, sanctions relief, peace treaty issues versus North Korean steps towards denuclearization. What should come first? That's a key challenge to overcome. and it remains to be seen whether they'll be able to see eye to eye and find a way through that.
John, how are you looking at this?
Obviously, I think it's first of all, it's very important that these channels are at least in place. So people are meeting up. We as a German government, we also very much are looking forward to the Beacon and Chesonhi channel to be established, to be fully working. And this could be another opportunity. I mean, for us, we don't want to give anybody any advice on which channel the progress could be made. As long as there's one channel that is working, we're happy with that. And this is also the point we're making to the North Koreans, who, as you all are aware of, are saying basically it's between the leaders. The leader that basic understanding was made on the top level. So they're quite obvious, they're quite openly saying that even Pompeo is basically working level. So everything from me to Pompeo is basically working level in their understanding, which is a little bit difficult to tackle. But we do make the point to them that these technical aspects and as Chad just pointed out, the sequencing of certain steps, and I think we have a big flurry of ideas floating around in all governments now, which is a positive sign that we're that flexible in thinking about solutions to the problem. But there has to be experts talking to each other about the concrete steps and the sequencing.
So for you, emphasis on the process, having the conversation, less important perhaps than the sequencing in and of itself, the timing, the pacing, is making sure that those technical level discussions are in fact occurring and continue to occur. Chad, do you think that this was something that was always going to be necessary? We were going to need some sort of interim compromise or corresponding measures, as North Korea has put out in its own state media? Or is this an indication that we're finally getting progress, that au contraire, that we're sort of at an impasse here? How do you read that?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind in the Singapore Declaration, there are 4 key points of agreement. The first is about rebuilding trust or building trust between the two countries. The second is about finding a way to formally end the Korean War. The third is the denuclearization, and the fourth is the prisoners of war. And I mean, by all accounts, there's been no progress really on any of those issues. We have a suspension of US ROK drills. We have a suspension of North Korean missile and nuclear tests. Both of those things can be reversed at any moment. And the problem is the North Korean view and the US view about what needs to come first in that bulletin of 4 points is completely different. And I think objectively speaking, there needs to be a step-by-step process. The idea that sanctions relief can only come when full denuclearization occurs is not realistic. There needs to be something a bit more nuanced that says, if X number of warheads can be dismantled or something, this can lead to this level of sanctions reduction. It's just all or nothing right now, which is not very constructive and not really likely to get much traction for Kim Jong-un. I mean, bear in mind, he's the leader, but he also has to get buy-in from his military and foreign ministry and various other security services. And to do so, he's going to need some kind of carrots to show that he's getting something out of this deal as well.
So I think you both are tasked with pretty impossible jobs, and that's to know the unknowable, to predict the future, to work in extremely low-level information environment, even by the standards of just journalism and diplomacy in general. North Korea is a particularly difficult subject area. So I want to ask how you navigate around that. What are the workarounds? Is it through building relationships? Are there any tried and true tricks that you've managed to develop over the course of your tenure? How do you deal with the deficit of information, and how do you learn how to use your gut to trust certain sources of information and not others? Is this the kind of thing that you think about a lot?
I mean, sometimes it's not actually a lack of information, but from our perspective, I think we have a decent amount of channels into the country in all over the world about North Korea. One part obviously being also chat and the media reporting about North Korea. But yes, to verify an information and to get the information that really is now the key for a certain question, that is obviously a huge challenge. And it was one of the main reasons, quite frankly, why we decided all over this time to always stay in dialogue with North Korea, to keep up our embassy there, to stay in a dialogue. We're not necessarily in a position where we're thinking about high-level dialogues like those who would be reported in the media, but we always try to keep basic conversation and understanding of each other's positions through constant dialogue, through missions in North Korean mission in Berlin and our mission in Pyongyang. And I think over time you build a certain radar when somebody tells you an information. And at the beginning, I must say, I started as a complete greenhorn there, going to Pyongyang, and every conversation was just spectacular. I thought I had understood North Korea completely, and I reported back, and it was great. But over time, you have that, I call it the basket of conversations, where you have certain pieces of information, and then you try to double check it with other partners who and try to get a better picture of whether this one piece of information that you're searching for is actually a valuable one. But in the end, I mean, that was the point we were making to all of our partners all the time. You will only be able to understand North Korea by talking to them and listening closely to what they're saying, because more often than not, North Korea is doing what they announced. So you just have to have that I think a certain toolbox to be able to get through your own perceptions and your own way of thinking, and analyze the North Korean declarations or the North Korean position through the other's eyes.
Right. So Chad, I'm going to get to you in a second, but maybe as a prompt, we could look at the image that we've used for our billboard here, which is some children inside North Korea who are looking at a propaganda poster, probably about an economic incentive-based
the metro, I think
slogan.
that is.
Yeah, have you seen this one before?
Yeah, it looks
Similar
like
type
one of the main
ones.
2 metro stations that tourists go to.
So they're looking at this, and we can only imagine what's going through their minds, what they're thinking, how they interpret their own propaganda, their own news media services. So for an outsider, that must be doubly difficult. So can you talk to us about how you manipulate information, how you've learned to trust some avenues and not others, or how you decipher what can be trusted, what can't be trusted, with an eye towards the fact that you're coming from it from the outside?
Well, when I set the website up in 2010 now, the thing I realized at first was there was so much gossip and very oftentimes incorrect reporting, especially in South Korean media, about North Korea. And I think a lot of it was based on single source stuff. It does seem to be getting a bit better, but it was a real problem. And so from the start, we always tried to focus on evidence-based reporting. So like when we do stuff about currency or economic changes or state media, agriculture, you name it, we always try and have photos, video, data, or satellite imagery to back up what we're saying, so that there is a primary source for everything. That's like our sort of gold standard that we try and use. In cases where it is just a rumor, we really meticulously try and back it up, and we can say something. I mean, like, for example, that 3 people have said this to be true, but 2 say it's not true. So we'll include that nuance in the story, because some stories by definition are very hard to prove. A good example is rumor of someone dying. You may have spoke to sources that believe it's true and others that don't. So we try and reflect that nuance. But the thing that I've sort of learned over the last few years is that there is a growing body of primary source stuff if you know where to look. And it's not just the North Korean state media. If you go on websites like Flickr, you can often find photo albums from tourists. If you go through those page by page, you often find small new details about consumer products or new technologies that are emerging or styles that are trending. And it's the same with video as well on YouTube. Since YouTube has recently clamped down on North Korea content due to sanctions, it's got a little bit harder, but there are still some places that you
Interesting.
can find good stuff.
What are the trends that you've seen emerging away from politics now for a second, but looking towards socio-cultural developments and technology, outside information, getting inside North Korea? I've heard the word sajangnim being used inside North Korean markets, which of course is a capitalist term that was absent from their lexicon for a long time. It means boss, right? So how do we see these changes affecting North Korean society? What are the big trends that you've seen over the course of your careers?
I mean, this is, I think, the most interesting part, with a long-term perspective for us, to see that the North Korean, that it's not a frozen society, that it's not it's a society that is evolving, that it's an economic system that is evolving, and the important question for us, obviously, is at what point could this really transfer into something meaningful on the policy side, on a real what people outside tend to call a change in North Korea. Because just because a society is changing and evolving, and just because somebody has a cell phone, doesn't mean that the society itself will develop in a direction that maybe a lot of Western diplomats and watchers would like it to change. So I'm always a little bit careful with all these trends when people say, "Oh, I've seen a cell phone, I've seen a taxi. They have something like Amazon now, and this is now the sign that there is an opening, that there is reform." I think there are reforms in a very small sized laboratory environment, where I think also the leadership and certain actors try to do new things. But it still, I think, has not reached that tipping point. But yes, things you're pointing out, information technology being a huge thing. People going into these little, it's called the shop for exchanging information technology, where you can load an app on your cell phone against if you pay $1 or something, and then they load on your cell phone an app to play. So it's really hard to quantify that. Like, are they catching up? I would say not, because all of our societies are even evolving at much higher speed, every society around North Korea. But is there some development? Is there some progress into that, what we call the Western world, into that modern age? Yes, obviously there is, and that is quite interesting, obviously, to follow for us.
With your own contacts inside North Korea, with your colleagues that you've had a chance to interface with, have you seen any changes due to the increased presence of advanced IT products, media from outside, the opening of these Jonghap Shijang marketplaces? Have you noticed any differences?
I mean, communication obviously has become a little bit easier now that basically everybody, at least with the people we would be in contact with, have a cell phone, or they can quickly check something on the intranet, like simple stuff like the weather report or some road conditions also, which is very important for driving. If you ever been in the countryside in North Korea, just knowing which bridges are damaged, which roads are closed off, where the military is now doing something where you can't pass, that is very important for every North Korean driver, not to drive us into these areas, but on an extension line, of course, also for us. Before that, you would have to stop and ask around, and now people just check their phones. That is obviously a change. I think another huge change is that electricity, they're more self-reliant, to use that term, when it comes to electricity. I think most of, again, the people we would talk to, I'm not talking about all of the 25 million here, but most of the people we would have contact with, they have at least these small battery packs or a solar panel in their homes. So they're more they have better access to electricity to then use all of these electronical devices, because in the beginning stages, which is when I was there, 2012, I think, where a lot of this information technology really came into the country more and more, they were not able to use it because they didn't have the electricity, right. Because they would wait for the 2 to 3 hours maybe in Pyongyang where you at a day where you could charge up your phone to then use it. But now they're more self-reliant, more independent in using also these information technologies.
And yeah, one of the things we noticed in 2017, we went on a reporting trip, and there was a lot of mainstream media from Europe, North America. Everyone's doing the let's do a Vox Pox interview about what they think about Trump, or and I just thought, hey, why don't we do something different and ask about fashion and food, and just like try some different questions that are theoretically non-political and will kind of go against the grain of any like grooming that may have taken place. And it was fascinating. We approached a couple young ladies who were frankly looking very South Korean, fashionable bags, branded, kind of luxury style, nice shoes, clear signs of plastic surgery, double eyelid surgery. And I asked, like, where are your inspiration for fashion? Where does it come from? And she couldn't answer for about a minute. She was just standing there looking very, very worried, kept looking at the guide. How do I kind of answer this? And then eventually came out with a scripted, socialist inspiration, thanks to our great leader. And it just didn't reflect anything that she looked like. And then when it came to food, I was asking these young guys on the metro, oh, do you like fried chicken? Because it's sold now in a couple of small places in Pyongyang, and I asked for their favorite foods, and they, again, same kind of reaction, then come back to Pyongyang naengmyeon and just classic Korean sort of cultural reference points. And so there are these changes taking place, but I feel that the official propaganda doesn't keep up with them. And so a really clear articulation of this is in North Korea. There are now several taxi services, Air Koryo, KKG. If you look on North Korean state media, you put in the word taxi, nothing comes up, zero results. They don't talk about this, even though there's competition taking place. So the state media is kind of not always up to date with the reality of the situation. And these are things that are being condoned and allowed. And
Interesting.
Yeah.
And in some other cases, we see the state media try to catch up in certain ways. For instance, with posters that show consumerist culture, shopping bags, and going around. That's something that you would not see under Kim Il-sung's leadership, right? So in what ways do you see that is there a convergence happening where there is a kind of a compensation happening for whatever reason, maybe tacit allowance of very limited size marketplaces in order to increase tax revenue, or because there's an admittance that the public distribution system isn't working? How do you see that negotiation taking place?
I mean, North Korea is, and it might sound a little bit weird, it's a very diverse society. You have very different, I think, lifestyles and opinions in this very rigorous totalitarian environment. And this is, I think, something sometimes people forget, that in every totalitarian society, in every dictatorship in the world, there were still people having some kind of underground culture, some kind of secret pact amongst themselves to develop a little bit of freedoms. But so I think the trends you describe are yes, they are there. But I must say, I'm always astonished if I go into a little bit more research on some propaganda, for example. You see these trends emerging and re-emerging, like the shopping bag, for example. You see it actually from the 80s and the 90s on, with department store number one. Let's have more consumer products in department store number one, and there's this very fancy ladies going shopping, and then it vanishes for like 10 or 15 years, and then it comes back as a trend. And then you have these, in the same state media, you have very, very different trends in that. Yes, for example, the TV, I think everybody would agree that the TV has become much more modern in its presentation, in the form, but not really in the content of it. When you see there's a kind of a super talent, like North Korea's Got Talent show going on, but obviously it's all, as Chad said, like it's all about the praise, who had most loyalty. Like the judging standards is who had the most loyalty for the leadership and who devoted most of its most efforts to the party, and the narrative sometimes it's actually even reverting, which I think it's hard to come to a conclusion. But some people would say it's it's also part of that anxiety in the regime, where they see the society advancing that at that pace and they're not able to control it completely anymore. And then you have all these references in state media about let's go back to the 50s lifestyle, like the good old 50s, which from our perspective is appalling. But from these like party cater propaganda department caters view, those were obviously good times. We had just won a war, and everybody was united in building a socialist powerhouse. And some people do still believe that, and I think those people are especially living in that party in the forbidden city where the party caters live, and they still have a lot of power over the narratives. So it's a lot of different narratives, a lot of different developments going on in the same time.
Wow. Yeah, Chad.
Well, one thing that we've noticed recently is there's been some evolution, as Jan said, relating to state media. The TV has become a bit more South Korean, some of the production techniques. But there's one story we're investigating at the moment, which I won't fully explain, but I'll give you a sort of outline of it because it's still a work in progress. But, with Trump, with the election, there was all this suggestion of like online bots and people supporting him that weren't real people and so forth. Well, we've started to see what looks like North Korea's first attempt at running and maintaining sock puppet accounts on Twitter, which present themselves as being non-North Korean people. In the case I'm thinking of, a Russian, and they have a very sophisticated way of by North Korean standards, of presenting positive things in the North. And I was able to exchange direct messages with one of these accounts for quite some time, and then it all ended when I think I just crossed an ideological path that was it was just too difficult for them to answer in a plain way, which was about the South Korean K-pop bands that came to North Korea. And I said, that was really interesting, but how come these North Korean people, most of them couldn't see this? There was no TV broadcast of it. Only Kim Jong-un and the elites in Pyongyang got to see it. That seems kind of against the principles of socialism and fairness for all. And I got kind of blocked after that. And and so, yeah, we'll have a story about this coming soon. But it's fascinating stuff and does show like a new evolution. But they start, I think maybe the person maintaining it has changed because it's just posting outright propaganda now, and it's kind of lost the veneer of being unique and organic. But yeah.
So a desire to take part in this globalized conversation about what's happening on the peninsula. So speaking of which, The Economist and a firm called Chartbeat recently did a news analysis for 2018, and they concluded that global readers spent 1.5 million hours with their eyes glued to screens in June of 2018 reading articles about the Trump-Kim summit. This was one of the most read articles, most read topics of the entire year. So with that being said, there's such a tremendous amount of interest and attention going on to the diplomatic situation going on in the peninsula. What do you think the mainstream media misses? What do you think the most popular forms of discourse are missing out on in terms of the nuances happening on the peninsula?
Well, I can give you one sort of illustrative example, which is that where about 5-6 years ago, we noticed that we would get a lot of traffic for things like just a photo gallery of something like daily life in North Korea. And there was a kind of mainstream obsession with learning about North Korea. And the problem with that spike that you're talking about, in 2017, we hired a web analyst, and he said that in 2017, there were 70 million articles written about North Korea worldwide. And in 2016, he said there were 5 million. And what the impact that creates is a dilution, actually, of interest. So websites like ours, which I would clearly argue provide a bit more nuance and a bit more detail, we actually sort of drop down the search rankings because a lot of these mainstream outlets start doing North Korea and building pages dedicated to North Korea. And so it actually dilutes the interest in a lot of the more serious websites, which I think has the negative effect that it journalists who are sort of maybe airdropped onto the subject become the main sort of voices for a lot of people's interest and curiosity in the country.
Thanks. Jan, any thoughts on that?
I mean, obviously, I think a whole topic that is left out of that media discussion because you don't have the access, or those people who have the material can't share it, is, and I would deliberately call it the humanitarian human rights complex of the picture, because of course some NGOs with access to the countryside, they will have some pictures, but most of the galleries Chad is describing, I mean, this is all the Pyongyang skyscrapers, nice restaurants and all of that. Very dear friend of mine who escaped North Korea said it's just the victims don't have faces for us. We talked about I have a little bit of a marketing background, and when I talk to all the colleagues from these times about human rights in North Korea, for example, they quite openly and quite cynically tell you, yeah, I mean, don't have pictures. We have, if you want to sell the issue, if you want to make people care, you have to have pictures of the oppression, of certain behavior by the state. And obviously, I myself have some of these experience. I have some pictures. NGO people will tell you from their countryside, from their trips to the countryside, will tell you about the situation there. But these obviously don't find the way into mainstream media as easily as the big Trump, Kim, these iconic figures stories. I just walked down the street here in New York, and there was some plumber's car. He had like these little troll dolls of Kim Jong-un and Trump with this like funny hair thing, which you can like come through, and this is how far it has come. It is like mainstream, iconic, like comical figure. So obviously these attract much more attention, but.
Yeah, and interestingly, on the humanitarian aspect of this, I saw a very compelling gallery shown to me in a private, off-the-record setting by an aid worker from an organization that is really, really struggling to raise money for their work inside the North. And I said to him, why don't you show these pictures? They would help you raise money, surely. It shows hospitals with no running water, as close as 20 miles from the South Korean border, which is just like exceptional to think that that's the polarity and difference. And he said the problem is that you can't, as a humanitarian organization, you can't always publish those photos because there is I think there's a feeling of embarrassment in the country that despite all this propaganda, there is very serious problems in the public health sector and water and sanitation. And so the NGOs can be in a catch-22 position where if they could show these things, it could help raise money. But it maybe puts the North Koreans in an embarrassing situation that the leadership is unable to address these things while building a 10,000 hotel room facility in Wonsan, Kalma, probably for South Korean tourists.
They certainly do very worthy work, a lot of these NGOs who operate under tough conditions and do their best despite that. I want to get to your questions, so I'll invite you to raise your hand and we'll come around with the microphone to you. Before that, I want to thank Chad and Jan, and please invite you to join me in thanking them. I think they did a wonderful job.